Okay, can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So first of all, thank you very much for this wonderful invitation. I feel very humbled to be here, even though online with you. So today I will talk about citizenship and about what kind of alternative notions of citizenship we can create in the case of return migrants from the US to Mexico. That is, Mexicans who migrated without documents to the US and then come back to Mexico. So I would first like to begin with a vignette so you have a little bit an idea of what a return migrant might feel when they arrive to Mexico. So Daniela was born in Mexico. She went to Miami with her parents when she was 2 and then went back to Mexico when she was 14 because her dad was deported. She told us, I can personally say that Mexico was not easy. I first didn't like it. I was affected by the violence. I was affected by a lot of ugly things, but finally I began to learn that I was a citizen, that I have rights, and that I can finally claim my rights. Today, I identify as a bocha. Bocha, we will see during this presentation, it's a derogative term, meaning half Mexican, half American, but in a negative way, which means that you are neither the one nor the other. So Dani belongs to the flow of migrants who returned to Mexico since the year 2000. She belongs to generation 1.5, a term coined by Rimbaud to define migrants who left Mexico at an early age, went to US schools, and had English as a dominant language. These young people generally identify socially, culturally, and linguistically with the US, even though they are formally citizens of Mexico. So my objectives of today, the aim of my talk will be to show that citizenship is a journey, a process during which one never finishes learning, and that there is not only one way to be Mexican, that the true Mexican that simply not exist. During this presentation, I will integrate the voices of several return migrants to exemplify the theoretical part of this talk. And the voices you will see in this presentation are voices from Mexican migrants from generation 1.5 who now live in different Mexican states. Sorry, I think there are many. They first migrated without documents with their parents when they were very young. They have been educated in the US and then went back to Mexico in a voluntary or involuntary form. They are all part of a research project funded by the Mexican Research Council, led by my colleague Monica Jacobo and myself in 2020. So in order to fulfill these objectives, I will first present the context, that is return migration, and who these young people from generation 1.5 are. Then we will have a focus on citizenship theories. Then I will briefly present the methodology and participants, the findings, discussion, and conclusion. So this research is part of the US-Mexican migration corridor, which here in Latin America is a unique case study because Mexico and US have a common border of 3,000 kilometers. So this migration began in the 19th century and flows increased and decreased during many years, depending on the Mexican and American economy and on the restriction of US migration policies. So return migration today is not new from the US to Mexico. It began with the first migration flows in the 19th century But at that time, there were only men who migrated from Mexico to the US to work, and then they went back to Mexico to see their family. So family stayed in Mexico. In the 20th century, the flow of migrants migrating to the US was higher than the other way around, and this situation inversed in 2015, when suddenly more migrants came back to Mexico than those who migrated to the US. So what is return migration? In the 80s, it was defined as a process by which international migrants return to their community of origin with the intent to resettle there. So we saw that this definition is not accurate today anymore, because migrants do not always return definitely. So they may come back to Mexico, go to the US again, or anywhere else. And this definition also takes for granted their ability to reintegrate themselves in Mexico, which is not so easy, as we will see. A few years later, Battistella defined return migration as a specific moment within the migratory project, so it's more general, a moment that can be followed by a new migration event, which can be internal, regional, or international, and therefore is not necessarily an endpoint. And we adopted Gandini's definition, which involves in return migration also the territory. So return migrants do not always return to their community of origin. Many of them settle in border cities because these border cities are more bilingual. The time frame, the period abroad is not defined. So you will see in our participants that some spent 5 years in the US and others spent 30 years in the US. And the motivation for the return lies on a continuum of voluntary and voluntary. And this involuntary has various degrees. It's not really voluntary if you go back because you have to follow your dad or your mother that was deported, or if you have to go back to Mexico because of racism and discrimination in the US because you lost your job and so on. And the profile of the return is also very different from one to another. And what we also have seen in research here in Mexico is that Mexican returnees who have spent many years in the US do not necessarily consider Mexico their home, nor do they feel accepted as Mexicans in Mexico. So what are the factors that trigger return migration? There are many. Economic factors are some of them, militarization of the US-Mexico border, aggressive deportation programs, the whole array of restrictive immigration policies in the US, family separation policies, family reunification in Mexico. Many of them come back because their parents are getting older, so they want to be more time with them. Or others, young people, come back to Mexico because they are unable to study in the US, so they come to study to Mexico. So during Obama's presidency, this presidency was called the age of mass deportation. Obama was called the deporter-in-chief because he deported many people between 2002 and 2018. The US deported 6.2 million people to their countries of origin. And because Mexicans are the greatest number of undocumented migrants in the US, they are also the greatest number of deportees. So in the same time, about 2 million Mexicans were deported to Mexico. So these deportations obviously increased family separation because families are mixed status families. So some have documents, others have no documents. So generally, when the father or the mother goes back to Mexico, young children, even though they are Mexican American, go back to Mexico. And those who are over 18 often stay in the US. And because children, as we will see, go to school in the US, there was also an increase in deportation of long-stay immigrants. So all these deportees are generally people from generation 1.5 or double nationals with an average of 31 years. And the narratives we will see further on are from this famous generation 1.5. So who are they? As I already mentioned, this is a term coined by Rimbaud in the US, and it refers to Mexicans, but not only Mexicans, any migrant who was born in his or her country of origin and who migrated to the US at an early age. So all these people go to school in the US, so they are long-stay migrants, and they are able to go to school there because there is a law which defines that undocumented children may not be denied access to school. So these people, these young people are socialized and is assimilated in US schools. English becomes their dominant language, and they develop and practice notions of belonging and membership in the US. And this is a highly interesting population for critical applied linguistics and critical citizenship studies because their experiences as migrants challenge traditional notions of belonging and citizenship, which are associated with nation states. So before we go to citizenship studies, I would like to present you a little bit their linguistic profile. So we have two kinds of bilinguals, simultaneous and sequential bilinguals, and this depends on their age of arrival. So those who are born in the US, which are Mexican Americans, they're not generation 1.5, or those who arrived at an early age, which are generation 1.5, learn both languages at the same time, English and Spanish, so their cognitive processes will be developed in both languages at the same time. So for them, the return to Mexico is not real because they do not know Mexico and they only have family ties with Mexico. On the other side, we have sequential bilinguals. They are born in Mexico and they're first learned Spanish in Mexico. Some of them went first to school in Mexico and then migrated to the US and learned English. So in their case, their cognitive processes are filtered through Spanish, and for them, the return to Mexico is real because they know Mexico. So in both cases, from the Mexican point of view, we call them return migrants with heritage language. And this differentiation is important because their type of bilingualism, as we will see, has implications on their language skills in both Spanish and English. So in both cases, in the US, English is their dominant language and Spanish their heritage language. And when they come to Mexico, it gets inverted. For simultaneous bilinguals, when they get schooled in the US, they have no problem in English. They acquire high literacy in English and they learn Spanish as a heritage language. So their Spanish is an everyday Spanish, everyday repertoire with their family and community. And then in addition to that, they also use different linguistic variations from Latin America because of all the migration of Latin Americans to the US. When they go back to Mexico, they will have comprehension problems in Mexico because their linguistic repertoire is only focused on everyday Spanish. So they have to learn more vocabulary, and they will have to learn how to write and to read in Spanish if they integrate the Mexican educational system. As far as English is concerned, if they go to public schools here, they will have to go to EFL classes, which where the English competency level is very low, so they get easily bored. And if they do not find a community where they can speak English, generally they will lose their English. On the other side, as sequential bilinguals, the biggest difference with them compared to simultaneous bilinguals is that if they reintegrate the Mexican education system, and depending on how long they were schooled in Mexico before they migrated, they won't have as many problems with Spanish literacy as simultaneous bilinguals. And this is a very important point in Mexico because in Mexico, it's not like in the US or Canada, where you have ESL classes, English as a second language classes. Here you have no Spanish as a second language classes for migrants, neither for indigenous people. So if they have problems to learn Spanish literacy, they will have to learn on their own, and it will often depend on the family's income if they can pay them private classes or not. So when this generation 1.5 is still in the US, they identify often as de facto Americans until they become adults. Until 18, as long as they go to school, they are protected from deportation. But once they become 18, they have no protection from deportation anymore, and often some of them even don't know that they don't have documents. So at 18, they have to transit to illegality and face multiple limitations. So, as I already mentioned, they cannot study a university degree, they cannot work in a qualified job, they cannot get a driving license. So all these prohibitions for them, because they are undocumented, has a huge impact on their identity formation and belonging. And even though some of them have access to DACA, which is a kind of 2-year work permit, it's called Deferred Action for Children Arrivals, which was created under the Obama administration to retain the best and the brightest. So some of them have this 2-year work permit, which is not accessible to everybody. It depends on the age of arrival to the US, and it's quite expensive. So those who get access to DACA, it is thought that they have more opportunities, but many studies have shown that even DACA students encounter limited possibilities for social mobility and generally only find low-paying jobs. So if this generation migrates to Mexico in a forced or voluntary form, they become what we call here return migrants. So once in Mexico, they enjoy all the rights which are associated with their citizenship, such as going to college, to university, to work in qualified jobs or buying property. But the problem here is that they feel highly uprooted and have weak ties with the community of origin. They are not familiar with the functioning of governmental institutions, and they speak but do not write Spanish. And all this questions their Mexicanity because they enjoy as citizens having the passport, because culturally, socially, and linguistically, they do not fit within the definition of what it means to be Mexican in this country. So, let's have a look what it means to be Mexican. Normally, citizenship is perceived from a traditional perspective of nation state. Citizenship means is a synonym with nationality. To belong to one or more particular national community, it means to have the right to have rights, and then it means that you have a passport which gives you rights and obligations. But we see that based on the whole international migration worldwide, and specifically return migration, which other colleagues also call remigration, they all challenge this perspective. Why? Because citizenship, like identity, are not fixed nor unmovable. This is why we wanted to opt from a more critical perspective and to see citizenship as a continuum. And that's why we adopted Isin's differentiation. He defines citizenship in two main points. So on one side, we have formal citizenship, which is the legal status, which gives you a nationality, rights, obligations, and a passport. And on the other side, we have the substantive citizenship, what Milani also calls a mode of conduct, a mode of being in one specific context. Bourdieu calls it also habitus, that is all the social practices, political, cultural, and symbolic practices of a nation state. So with this differentiation, what we want to understand is the path of citizenship that these migrants must travel from their departure from the US to their arrival in Mexico. So in the US, these migrants, what they have developed is substantive citizenship. That is, they acquired all the values, cultural norms, and English as a dominant language in the US. But what they did not have is access to the formal citizenship. And when they come to Mexico, they will have this formal citizenship, but they will have to face a nation state which was created in the 19th and 20th century, which is based on an ideology we call here the mestizaje ideology. So what is this ideology? It's a cultural mix between indigenous African and European heritage. The focus is more on European heritage than on indigenous heritage, as you may know. And the aim is to, from the government, since its creation, was and still is to homogenize culturally and linguistic diverse populations. So may it be indigenous people or migrants, they all have to adopt Spanish as the unique language and become mestizos. And since then, on an educative basis, they also have created social and educative assimilation policies, which, even though they accept diversity, they accept that it exists, but they still perceive it as a problem and not as a resource. So what we see in this context is, might it be indigenous people or migrants who have diverse linguistic variations, different linguistic repertoires and fonts of knowledge, all this diversity is not valued in Mexico. Why? Because they must assimilate to the standard mestizaje ideology based on Spanish as the unique language and mestizaje as the unique identity. So once they come back to Mexico, As we already said, they have the formal citizenship, which they did not have in the US, but they have to learn to be legal again. As they had to learn to be illegal there, here they have to learn to be legal again. And they have to acquire all the social, institutional, political, cultural, and symbolic practices of Mexico. Their languages get inversed, and they have to develop Spanish literacy and more linguistic repertoires that will fit their specific professional or educational context. So we see then that return migrants' realities and experiences show very big limitations of the traditional definitions of citizenship. Citizenship is not one fixed identity, one fixed language. As a matter of fact, we saw that return migrants have particular linguistic and unique linguistic profiles with Spanish, with different Latin American linguistic variations, English with different linguistic variations, and some of them also speak Spanglish. So based on these facts, what we saw is that we need to create a new vocabulary of citizenship as a process with tensions and different definitions. And in order to add to the formal and substantive citizenship, we also added some other concepts that will help us to understand when return migrants feel as second-class citizens here in Mexico, they will feel de-citizenship or disabled citizenship. And some of them, once they feel this, they will try to fight the status quo. They will try to break with the pre-established norms of the mestizaje ideology, which represents what a real Mexican should be. And in order to find the status quo, they will enact acts of citizenship or acts of linguistic citizenship. So they will become subjects with the right to claim rights as citizens with diverse identities, languages, and knowledges that are different to the pre-established norms. Or if they incur in acts of linguistic citizenship, they will take control over their own linguistic repertoires. They will decide when to use the different variations of English, Spanish, and Spanglish. So as far as the methodology is concerned, this was a multi-situated qualitative research in 5 Mexican states, in Jalisco, Veracruz, Mexico, Puebla, Baja California. And for this presentation, we worked with 2 subgroups. One group was part of an NGO of return migrants in Puebla, where I live, and another group participated in a programming boot camp that trains specifically return migrants to become web programmers. We did interviews, focus group, and surveys. In this presentation, we worked with 13 return migrants from generation 1.5. Most of their schooling was in the US, as we will see. And what we saw is that their personal narratives show an acute awareness and discussion about what it means being Mexican citizens in Mexico. So this is a chart, I hope you can see it, of the 13 participants, which gives you a little bit an idea of how long they stayed in the US and Mexico. So the first part here in gray is the time they spent in Mexico. Then when they migrated to the US, so all this, their time in the US and the time they came back to Mexico. So you can see people like Lenny, who spent maybe less time in the US, and others like Efrain, which is older, obviously, and spent more time in the US. He, as a matter of fact, was born in Mexico at 1 year. When he was 1, he migrated to the US, and now he just came back to Mexico. So the findings. So first of all, formal citizenship. So they have to relearn to have rights. As I explained, in the US, they had to learn to have no rights, to be illegal. And once they come back, they have to relearn to have rights. And obviously, this legal status is the most positive aspect of their return. They really enjoy learning to be legal again, to have the 4 basic rights, to have access to formal jobs, education, and health, and to be able to exist administratively. So Danny, for example, said, I began to learn that at last I'm a citizen, that I have rights, that at last I can make a claim. Even though migrants also go out to complain in the US, here I have the right to vote. And Estefania said, it's nice to see my check and see my name on it. I don't have to do things underwater. I'm very happy with the decision I made to move back. I have my house, that's all, that's what I like. What I like the most, sorry, about being here. Well, as I said, this is my country, it's where I was born, and I have many rights that we don't have in the US as adults. So Danny, as a member of the programming bootcamp in Mexico City, was very politically aware of her rights. She's very clear that being Mexican is a gradual and intensive learning process. Estefania enjoys being able to exist administratively in Mexico and no longer follow the common practices among undocumented population in the US of having to use a false name and social security number in order to be able to work. In Mexico, she can also buy a house in her own name, which she could not do in the US. As far as substantive citizenship is concerned, there are multiple learning processes, and we will see that as a continuous and constant learning of Spanish as a language, cultural and social norm, history, geography, and so on. Danny said, I realized that even though they told me that I was Mexican American in the US, I didn't know anything about Mexico. And even though they told me I was bilingual, I spoke Spanglish, and my Spanish was Caribbean Spanish because I grew up in Florida. So maybe a Boricua understood me better than a Mexican. Like I wasn't bilingual, I wasn't bicultural. And Estefania also added, when you begin to speak and everybody tells you that you sound very strange, it's difficult to speak like this. So these two testimonies show the contrast between having formal citizenship, but not having the basic linguistic competencies to be able to integrate. Danny also shows an additional interesting point, how she incorporates a Mexican dominant ideology here in her learning process, that is to be recognized as a Mexican bilingual. One cannot speak Spanglish because it is not perceived as a language, but as a deviation from the norm. Nor can one speak Caribbean Spanish. To be bilingual and bicultural in Mexico, you have to speak Mexican Spanish and know Mexican culture. So because during these multiple learning processes, as I said, what many of them feel is this citizenship, because they feel tensions. On one side, they feel linguistic tensions, and on the other, cultural tensions, and many others more. But let's focus on the linguistic and cultural one. So as far as linguistic tensions are concerned, they have to confront the single citizenship conception of one identity, one language. They have to learn new linguistic repertoires as adults, and they have to learn Mexican Spanish and Spanish literacy. And during this process, they feel discriminated against linguistically. Javier said, for example, they made fun of me because I did not speak Spanish well. I felt discriminated against. Or Danny also said, they literally think we are illiterate or something like this. Eve and Francisco answered, we are discriminated against because of Spanish. Coming here, running into a wall with people of your own nationality, it feels ugly to be discriminated against. So by feeling linguistically discriminated against, they feel like second-class citizens, or they feel that their citizenship is taken away from them. They also feel cultural tensions. Then he said, I have been told that I am a traitor to my homeland, and it seems like I have to buy my right to be here or become Mexican enough to be accepted in this community. They think I have to give them my English or my knowledge of that language to be accepted as Mexican. And she also added, many times you are confronted with the fact that you are treated as a second-class citizen and you are back to being a minority here as well. So in terms of cultural tensions experienced during their recurrence, Danny told us what it was like to not be perceived as Mexican enough. She felt the same in the US about not being American enough. To be Mexican, you don't have to speak another language, in this case, English. And this feeling of not fitting in and even being discriminated against leads these young people to develop resistance strategies to create their own Mexican identities. And here we will focus on 4 main strategies that this generation used. So first of all, some of them look for a bicultural community where they can socialize and associate with other young migrants. Tanya, for example, said it is a very strong community. She's in the programming boot camp in Mexico City. And she says it's a very strong community where very strong support networks are created. If I have my family also has a huge amount of stigmas against me. Why I am back, they don't understand you, but in this community we build identity, a bicultural identity. Many people here say, yes, I am Bocho, and I'm very proud to say so. Spanglish is spoken in entire freedom. So through this first strategy, we see that they use Spanglish as an act of linguistic citizenship. It shows belonging to a bicultural identity through the use of a language not accepted in the Mexican nation state, a state that favors linguistic purity. It also shows the power to exercise control over their linguistic repertoires by using those with which they most identify. The second strategy is to use their bilingualism and biculturality as a resource, and they switch this idea of a diversity as a problem in Mexico to diversity as a resource. They recognize their own fonts of knowledge as professional advantages, and at the end, they commodify their linguistic competences. Joel said, speaking Spanish for me was bad because I never used it in the US. Or being bilingual was bad because people didn't appreciate it. And I get here and the jobs I am applying for, they call me the following day and want me to work for them because I speak English. So you get prepared in the US without knowing it. Everything I know is worth a lot. So based on the second strategy, they commodify their fonts of knowledge, their bilingualism and biculturalism as a resource that has an exchange value, which clearly responds to the competencies required in the global economy of late capitalism. Others try to change their narrative. They replace the narrative of precariousness, which is associated with return migration, with a narrative of upward social mobility. Then he said, in the US, I was a dishwasher. Now I am an engineer. So I think we have to self-empower. So in this case, it's a kind of American dream in reverse. Dani tries to obtain in Mexico what her parents dreamed to obtain in the US, but couldn't because they were undocumented and had to live in the shadows. But here we have to clarify that this only happens as what we have seen in the different projects we are working with, only if the person has strong economic and emotional support in Mexico. And the last strategy is when they really are able to define their own definition of what it means to be Mexican in Mexico. And they also say that it is a process that it's constantly evolving. And I like this excerpt very much. Dani said, I identify myself as a pocha. I exemplify it when you sit in a bus and you sit down between two people and you have to make space so you can fit. And you have to kind of force to make them move so you can fit, so that we fit all together on the same seat. There is not just one sole definition of what it means being Mexican. So we saw through Dani's excerpts, so I showed several excerpts about her, and we saw that she first felt as a fake Mexican because she did not possess the Mexican substantive citizenship. She did not speak Mexican Spanish, couldn't write it, and did not know Mexican history. She then developed the Mexican habitus by learning the language, the history, geography, and so on, and tried to become a true Mexican. However, she felt discriminated against because she spoke differently, had different values, and began to accept that she was different. And it is by accepting this difference and not wanting to be homogenized that she began to create her own definition of what it means being Mexican for her. So let's jump to the conclusions. So what we saw in this presentation and this research is that indeed citizenship is dynamic and performative, that generation 1.5 in Mexico, when they return, they have to learn to be formal citizens, they have to learn to be legal versus, as we already said, learning to be illegal in the US. And obviously having formal rights is the most positive experience. But it's not so easy for them to reinvest their symbolic capital in Mexico. They generally work in call centers, in software companies, and in English language teaching, which are the few valorizing spaces for them and to really valorize their bilingualism and biculturalism. They have to learn the nation state's habitus, so they have to develop this substantive citizenship, which is a long and ongoing learning process, which means an emotional engagement. So it's like kind of reverse reintegration. First, they had to integrate in the US and then in Mexico. And they have to learn Mexican manners, Mexican Spanish, literacy, colloquialism, and so on. They have to learn to be Mexicans in Mexico because it's not the same being a Mexican in Mexico than a Mexican in the US. In Mexico, they learn it through very strong tensions because there is a clear clash between their multiple identities versus the single nation state identity, which wants to homogenize them. So because of this homogenizing identity in Mexico, they often feel as second-class citizens. And some of them, not all of them, but some of them, if they become agents of their own definition of what it means to be Mexicans in Mexico, they become agents by enacting acts of citizenship and acts of linguistic citizenship. So here we see that agency is one of the most important points here for return migrants, because it allows them to constantly negotiate with the habitus of the state in order to create their own habitus as Mexicans in Mexico. Muchas gracias. If you are more interested in this research, you can have a look at this paper, which I published with my colleague Monica Jacobo and another colleague. And here we have a webpage which explains all the projects we are working on related to return migration in Mexico. Thank you very much.